Welcome to TCN Talks. The goal of our podcast is to provide concise and relevant information for busy hospice and palliative care leaders and staff. We understand your busy schedules and believe that brevity signals respect. And now, here's our host, Chris Como.
Hello, and welcome to TCN Talks. I'm super excited today. Our guest is Bob Tavares. Bob is the Chief Commercial Officer with HealthPivots. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Bob, I think we're going to call our show today 100% of healthcare in ACOs or accountability care by 2030. What does that mean and why should we care? And so I think that's going to be a fun thing for you and I to unpack. But before we go there, I'd love for you to share, as I do with all of our guests, what does our audience need to know about you?
I've been in healthcare for about 25 years. I was, 4 or 5 years into my career, I was working at Forrester Research, and they were a thought leader. They were analyzing what impact is this new internet thing going to have on other technologies going to have on industry, on strategy. And at the time, I was in business development and covering all industries. I'd meet with a bank in the morning. I would meet with a retailer in the afternoon. And we had an opportunity to verticalize our sales force. And I chose healthcare. And I chose it because, candidly, it was so broken.
Wow.
In banking, from a technology perspective, even back in the 90s, things were really pretty sophisticated. You could put your ATM card in a machine in France, and it knows your balance. It knows it knows how much money you have and how much you can take out. It's just interoperability, data transparency, accuracy. You check your bank balance on the ATM, and it matched, if you called, or it matched if you went into the physical branch. And in healthcare, nobody can tell you, when the last time you had your hemoglobin A1C tested, and folks, providers didn't even know how many diabetics they had. Never mind how many were overdue for certain services. So it was paper-based records. It was an industry that had not embraced technology. So I said, if I'm early in my career and I want to be at the intersection of technology and improvement, why not go into an industry that hasn't even started that process? And we have come a long way in 25 years. Those 25 years have been largely on the managed care side. I've worked at health plans, and have sold services into health plans, as well as accountable care organizations. So I have a pretty good sense of how they think, how they operate, how they use data, how they think about improvement. It's been about 5 years now that I've been focusing on the serious illness space. I've done some work around advanced predictive modeling and machine learning on how to get essentially the right care to the right patient. How do we predict who's heading for avoidable admissions, who's nearing the end of life and might need a palliative care consult, those types of things. And I really decided over the past several years to dedicate my career to technology improvement and serious illness care. And I sort of have found myself at HealthPivots. I joined in January as the Chief Commercial Officer, which puts me in overseeing customer success and product strategy. So are we building what customers need, and are they using it properly, getting value, and are they not just okay with our partnership relationship, but are they thrilled? Are they getting more value than they're certainly paying for? And would they recommend us to others? And so we're trying to really build that culture around. We've always had exceptional product. Mm-hmm. We've always gotten the math right. We're mathematicians, we're biostatisticians, but we also want to make sure that the customers fully know how to translate that into results. So you have to really lean in on the customers. And frankly, the customers need to, we have several hundred customers. Many of them are hospice, home health agencies. We also work with health plans. We work with physician groups, particularly geriatric primary care groups. We work with accountable care organizations. And they all are at different levels of sophistication as it relates to using data for improvement. Mm-hmm. And our goal is to get them, raise the data literacy across all of our clients. No matter where they're starting at, they all need to improve. There's always room for improvement, of course. Yep. And then some hospices have further to go. And per the title of this talk, for the past 40 years, you can kind of get away without it. And in the next chapter of this industry, of the hospice industry, you're not going to survive if you don't have a good handle on your operations and your data and your performance and your referrals and your overall what's going right, what needs to be improved, and how do you continually get better every single day.
Well, we're going to go there in just a second, Bob. I just made a couple comments. And, sometimes you just look back, like let's say, a restaurant becomes very successful in your community. And you're like, that just makes so much sense. I'm glad they did that. You ending up at HealthPivots just makes so much sense. I'm kind of a talent connoisseur and just have a deep appreciation for highly talented, high performers. If you and I happen to talk, which we didn't, and you'd say, Chris, where's the best place in the country for me to end up? Oh my gosh, HealthPivots would have been it. So I just got to call that out, Bob. I can't tell you how excited. And as you and I were talking during the show prep, I'm just so excited now that I even understand more of your background. In fact, that's probably a good segue. I'll ask the question up front, but then I'll use an analogy. And the question is, given your background, is quality about ready to matter for us like it did in manufacturing? And I was sharing with you, I was a little bit, I guess, behind you, and I didn't spend as much time in manufacturing, but I did grow up. GE was like the Amazon of the day when I was coming out of business school. That was a place to go to work, and I was fortunate. The second place I went to work was Cooper Industries, and they modeled their whole executive development program after General Electric. And so I got to see this whole Six Sigma, lean, coming to manufacturing, of course, all the offshoring stuff, but the cool thing about manufacturing, and those of you on video, I'm holding up my cell phone. If we were making cell phones, and this is the ideal cell phone to the exact specifications and then the functionality, we now have an ideal. And then as other things come off the manufacturing line, you've got systems and processes to compare it to that ideal. That's the general concept of quality. And there's a whole, I'm oversimplifying a world of thought. And Bob and I were talking about like our hero is Deming. I love Deming. I quote Deming quite often. And so the challenge is, and Bob, I was like this 25-year-old when I came into hospice, CFO, and these nurses are like, yeah, but Chris, I hear what you're saying about manufacturing. We're not making widgets. This is all art. And, the loosey-goosey, artsy, God's people doing God's work has kind of ruled a lot of the day in hospice care, maybe in all of healthcare for that matter. And I was also privileged for 2 years to be part of the Studer Group. And what the Studer Group did is they really were the people that helped hospitals become more disciplined about patient satisfaction. And then I started to see there was a whole world of a framework here, not just service, but also quality, also growth. In other words, every facet of your organization. So a long way around the barn for me to say, so Bob, are we on the cusp that finally is quality going to start to matter? And we'll keep it in the serious illness space because gosh knows we go a lot of tangents if you talk about healthcare as a whole. But is it about ready to matter like, what you saw in your background in manufacturing?
Yes. And I'd like to broaden the conversation to not just quality, but performance, efficiency. I hear a lot of organizations, not-for-profit hospices who are disgruntled with the profit margins of for-profits. And why is profit bad? And why is your inefficiency and the wastefulness in your processes somehow something we should be striving for? So I think about performance across all aspects of an operations.
Yep.
And gathering data and using that data to improve. And you had mentioned earlier, the outcome is, the process gets the outcome. And if you don't have a design, as your colleagues were advocating for, we can't design this care model. We can't cookie cutter this. We can't define it. We just have to just wing it. And there's going to be no consistency day to day. There's no consistency between clinician and clinician. We have to somehow, some way get to the point where we are more adamant about designing the process across all aspects of what we do. And one of the things that we do is hire salespeople, and then we train salespeople. So how do we target the right ones? How do we train them? In the pharmaceutical world, before you're allowed to go talk to customers, you're going through weeks and weeks and weeks, 40 hours a week training in order to make sure you've got the knowledge and the skills to go represent that brand in when talking to clinicians. And I don't see that in the hospice and home health. We just hire whoever seems like the right fit, and then within days they're out talking to important customers with often big knowledge gaps. And
Boy, There is a lot of truth right there, Bob. Just a couple comments. There's several things that we do, and I've seen exactly what you're saying. I may be a slow learner because now I'm about 28 years in the industry, and the last 7 of my life have been in Telios. But what you're poking on is exactly why we're doing this work within Telios. And so when I look back, like 4 Seasons is where I was first a CEO. We grew dramatically. We went from about 20, 30 patients a day to 200. And then I left for 2 years, worked for Studio Group, and then I came back to 4 Seasons. The greatest blessing of my life was coming back to an organization that I was at before. Because when you start going, who's this clown that just grew us and put no system and process? And you got to go, oh, that's me. I'm the guilty one. So in other words, you could show up in hospice because so many people were dying and it was such a unmet need, and you can grow and you think you're successful just because you're growing, and then that makes the financial numbers look good. But if you're not bringing that system and process, it's kind of a house of cards. And I hope some leaders listening to this are getting a little uncomfortable because that was my reckoning, and it's the blessing of my life of coming back to 4 Seasons a second time, realizing it takes both. And so there's 2 things, Bob, when I listen to you. Number one, we talk quite often about the quadruple aim, which I recently hear is actually going now to the sextuple aim. I think that's the right word. But we talk about the quadruple aim that John Berwick said, hey, if you want to take it to the future, you got to be working on better service, better quality, a lower cost of care, and a great employee experience. And so we have a framework, Bob, that we work with all of our hospices. Like you think about what makes hospice special and different. It looks at the human being as body, mind, spirit, social, emotional component. It looks at them holistically. What I'm hearing you say is you've got to look at your organization holistically and have a framework that challenges you to do that. And if you do that, you're going to see that actually show up in the quadruple aim. But then the other way is what you were talking about. You and I were talking in pre-show. I love that Deming quote, every system is perfectly designed to produce the results it produces. Our family were a little bit of a smart butt, sometimes a little sarcastic to mess with each other. It's kind of a sarcastic comment. Like, people are sitting in the room and going, man, we're having this problem. And then sometimes I'll say, every system is perfectly designed to produce the results it produces. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way to go, is there a system? Is there a process? And if it is it working for us? And so I love what you're saying because I think in many cases throughout the country, just because hospice was so much of an unmet need, you could have grown. And you think you're successful because you've grown and you hired a lot of people. And one of the analogies we use, Bob, you and I are somewhat of a similar age. I can remember we still had forms in the organization. And you had all these, forms floating about. And then when the form is on the copier, it gets a little sideways. And then it gets further sideways. And you get the copy of the copy of the copy. And that's actually what happens in organizations. So like, let's say Bob's a high performer. We hired him. He's a great hospice nurse, but then Chris is the one after him and he's not so good. And then Chris is training the third one after that, and there's no systems and process. And I think that's an interesting kind of editorial on what we've kind of seen in hospice and palliative care. And the positive side is we could do something about that. Would you push back on any of that, Bob, or does that resonate as another way of saying what you're saying?
No, it's what I'm saying. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with a client where 50% of their patients die within 7 days. So they have, as a result, one of the lowest overall length of stays in their market. And I said, how do you compensate your sales reps? Oh, it's a big part of their compensation is based on number of admissions, irregardless of length of stay. Mm. So they're going to the hospital where the admissions are easy to come by. And they're all very short stays, and it's affecting. And meanwhile, they've got, let's just say they have 50% overall market share of patients or market share of days. And what's your market share in assisted living and nursing homes? Because your competitor has a defined strategy and process to target those settings. And so how you compensate your employees will get the outcome it's designed for. In this
Every
case,
system is perfectly designed to produce the result it produces. Wow, that's well said. Well, Bob, one thing I wanted to, I had someone that texted me. I don't remember it feels like it was a couple months ago, and said, "Hey, I just read that by 2030, 100% of all of Medicare will be in ACOs." And the interpretation was that means a lot of us have ACOs in our area. A lot of them sometimes are health system driven. There are other physician-led ACOs, et cetera. But that person's interpretation is, well, that means we don't have to worry about Medicare Advantage. They're all going to be on ACOs. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, I don't think that's what Medicare means. They want 100% of beneficiaries in value-based care or in an accountable care relationship. So I think both Republicans and Democrats are more than happy for Medicare Advantage to grow, as you know, for Medicare to delegate the risk and to get out of the risk management business. And there are some patients who will not choose to join a Medicare Advantage plan. And for those, they want them assigned to an accountable care relationship. That could mean, it doesn't necessarily mean the Medicare Shared Savings Program or the REACH program. Those are the two most common accountable care contracts for fee-for-service beneficiaries. It could mean, you know, that you're in a primary care first, or that you are in making care primary, which is a new model that's out, or maybe even enhancing oncology or the kidney care choices model. But it's some type of value-based contract. They want every patient, every beneficiary to have somebody managing the total cost of care, somebody accountable for the total cost of care. And certainly Medicare Advantage is now, you know, 50%. In some markets, 60 or 70% of all beneficiaries. And then whoever's left over is going to be assigned to an ACO or some type of accountable relationship. Patients have to opt in for Medicare Advantage, but they do not have to opt in to be assigned or attributed to an ACO. And in fact, not only do they not opt in, they cannot opt out of that. So you may want to stay on original Medicare and have original fee-for-service, but whether you like it or not, there is this third party that's going to be managing your total cost of care. You can opt out of what's called data sharing, where your claims data won't go to that ACO, but you can't opt out of the notion that somebody is overseeing your total cost of care.
Bob, if they change primary care providers, does that potentially change their attribution over the course of time? Or how does that work if they change primary care providers and they're in an ACO?
Yeah, if they actively choose a different primary care provider, it triggers what's called voluntary alignment. So they can say, I used to be with Dr. Smith, I now want to go to Dr. Jones, and I want Dr. Jones to be accountable for me. Essentially they're switching ACOs at that point.
Okay.
Otherwise, it takes time for that new provider to eventually build up the plurality of primary care claims. And they could get attributed a quarter later or 2 quarters later, or maybe the following year, depending on what model it's in.
Thank you to our TCN Talks sponsor, Delta Care RX. Delta Care RX is also the title sponsor for our May and November 2023 Leadership Immersion courses. Delta Care RX is primarily known as a national hospice, PBM, and prescription mail order company. Delta Care RX is a premier vendor of TCN and provides not only pharmaceutical care, but also niche software innovations that save their customers time, stress, and money. Thank you, Delta Care RX, for all the great work you do in end-of-life and serious illness care.
Well, you and I could, and we probably should do a couple of podcasts together because, we could chase the rabbit trail of Medicare Advantage. There's all these other interesting things like SNP plans, PACE program. You just did a great presentation, by the way, and thank you. We got a lot of great compliments for a presentation you just did for our telehealth CEOs. But I wanted to focus the last half of the show on specifically ACOs. It seems like, and I was an early mover, an ACO that was in the Western North Carolina area. We went to them because we thought, hey, this is logical. We've got great palliative care services. We can decrease the overall spend, and just never felt like we got any traction. And so is there a reason why ACOs have not paid attention to hospice and palliative care programs? And do you think we're maybe in a space where that might be changing?
Yeah, well, if you go back a decade, none of the ACOs had downside risk. They were upside only. So if you generated savings, you got a check, and if you didn't, no harm, no foul. Increasingly, now I think 2/3 of MSSP ACOs have downside risk. So if things don't go well, you're writing Medicare a check for the difference. And so you up your game a little bit there. The other thing that's new is that, in the early days, if I've got 50,000 patients in my ACO, maybe 3.5% are dying each year. Meanwhile, so it's still a meaningful number of patients who are dying, 1,500, 2,000, and they are costly. And you would think that there would be processes, the strategies for managing those. But meanwhile, I have got 50,000 patients who need flu shots and need, I got to figure out how to get mammograms and colonoscopies and diabetic A1C tests. And I've got all these quality measures I have to focus on where there are, the numerator is thousands and thousands and thousands of patients who are eligible for these screenings. And I got to get my clinicians focused on this blocking and tackling of quality. And so, I think just the law of numbers took over, and all of the population health tools that were released a decade ago, even several years ago, were really focused on guiding care to those types of patients, closing those gaps in care, closing HCC coding opportunities. End of life was, I think the time has come.
So I was going to say, it feels like you're building up to, and it feels like now we're getting in a different place. And ACOs have been around for what, about like 10 years, 10 plus years? Closer
to 15.
Okay.
The Affordable Care Act really opened the doors for these programs. And in fact, the Medicare Shared Savings Program is in law. It's in the Federal Register. It came out of the Affordable Care Act, which was, late 2000s.
Yep.
And so we're, I don't know if we're in year 14. And again,
so if those early ACO patients were in their 65 or so, now they're actually getting close to 80, which is a pretty big demographic where you're dealing with end-of-life care, certainly serious illness. Am I reading that right?
I think there was 80-year-olds back then too, but it was more of just the ACOs were hospital-led the early days because they're the ones that had the capital, they had the relationships with the physician networks, and they, I think, largely started ACOs so they can get the claims data to see what their competitors are doing. But they had no downside. So what's the harm? And over time, physician-led ACOs emerged. And it turned out physician-led ACOs significantly outperformed hospital-led ACOs. Because the hospitals don't really want to empty the hospital beds, right?
I can't believe you said that on air, but I totally agree with you.
Well,
it's true.
I'm sorry. It is absolutely true.
I've sat in many a meeting trying to make the case for palliative care, and the hospital CFO goes, we don't really want to prevent that patient from coming back because we get another DRG.
Yeah, I remember working with a large ACO customer, over 100,000 attributed lives. And, we were designing predictive models to identify folks who had avoidable admissions and things like that. And we had proposed addressing overuse of orthopedic procedures, hip, knee, and back surgeries that are overutilized. We knew one of my clients, was a specialty hospital doing orthopedic surgeries, and they do a lot of second medical opinions. And they're like, at least a third of the time, 40% of the time we get a referred a patient, we conclude they are not a good candidate for surgery at all.
30 to 40%.
30 to 40% of, and then even the American College of Cardiology said, 40, 50% of stents are unnecessary, are inappropriate. And so there's just massive overuse. So, but if you propose to an ACO, hey, we want to design a program to reduce ortho procedures, they're like, okay, hold on.
That's where our margins are.
Patients out of the, keeping heart failure patients out of the hospital, we'll buy into, but we're not really ready to tackle the cardiologists or the orthopedic surgeons right now.
Wow.
We still want the volume where it's at because it's still a fee-for-service world in most hospitals.
Wow, you're a treasure trove, Bob. We could keep talking hours on this, but at least thank you, because I think there are a lot of hospice leaders out there who have kind of suspected that was the case. Bob, now that ACOs are becoming more important for hospice palliative care programs to look at, is there data in HealthPivots that they can utilize that could kind of direct them to ACOs within their area? Yeah,
so to conclude that last concept, is it time, right? Will we start to see traditional ACOs, community-based providers that take care of tens of thousands of ACO patients? They have a 3 to 4% mortality rate, and there's a segment of improvement that could be had at end of life. And I think we are close to that becoming a reality.
Yeah, thank you. Because actually, I'm sorry, my mind was working so quickly. What I heard you clearly say, this is my interpretation, they've picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit off the tree, and this is now, the time is really coming where now this is a good focus for them. They probably got their basic blocking and tackling down as an ACO, and so this is a new frontier where us partnering with them could help them find additional savings within their total spend that exists today. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Now that they've got downside risk, they've got the blocking and tackling in place in terms of closing gaps in care for screenings and other preventative measures. They've got the HCC coding down pat, these more mature ACOs. And now I do believe that they're evaluating how to get the most out of end-of-life care. Because we talk about the carve-in into Medicare Advantage. Well, hospice is already carved into ACO budgets.
Yep.
So they're paying, the average ACO has a budget, per capita budget of about $10,000, $12,000 per patient. Under what scenario can we afford $60,000 of hospice care for a year of care? And so, certainly those higher cost patients are factored into the overall budget number, because some patients cost nothing and some patients cost $60,000 or $100,000. And you end up with an average of $11,000, $12,000, $13,000 per patient per year. But these are big ticket items. If you're an ACO, you're trying to go after the big ticket items. Hospitalizations, they've all been trying to keep people out of the hospital, admissions, readmissions. And now we're looking at this other relatively large spend. On a per capita basis, it's not there because not that many patients receive a year of care. But it's, $12,000, $15,000, $20,000 in a very short amount of time.
Yep.
And they want to make sure that's hitting the sweet spot in terms of value.
Got it. In fact, we'll talk about that, and we'll go into some extended play for our Teleask Network. I want to ask you some specific questions about that dollar amount. And so can HealthPivots help people? Because I think you're making a good case that kind of our time is coming now. So can people utilize HealthPivots to find and kind of mine some data to start kind of doing some market analysis on ACOs in their area?
Yeah, so we have tools to help you understand who are the ACOs in my market. How many, there's a lot of publicly available data on the fact that XYZ ACO has 100,000 lives. Well, how many of those are in my county? How many of those are in my service area? And how many of those patients in my service area die, and do they receive hospice care or not? And if they do they use my agency? So if you want to go talk with an ACO, you should be armed with all that information. You should say, listen, you've got 100,000 patients in your ACO. A third of them are in my service area, and we're delivering care to 80% of your hospice patients. And I'd like to talk about our quality and how we can help you. We're not doing burdensome transitions. And we're keeping people out of the hospital. We're contributing to the overall total cost of care management. And we'd like more than 80% of your referrals, because I think we do a much better job than your other choices in terms of keeping people out of the hospital. And we have a mind toward total cost of care management. Our goals are your goals. And I think, the hospice customer is changing. The customer has largely been Medicare. And to keep Medicare happy, you have to a very low bar. You have to try to avoid audits. But other than that, it's an interesting customer who pays full price on time, and not a lot of haggling. The customer is changing, and we have to know the customer. And if that customer is an ACO or if that customer is a Medicare Advantage plan, we have to think the way they think. We have to understand their incentives. And we have to realize that in large part, their top priority is total cost of care management.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'll let you do final thoughts so we can wrap up. It also seems like physician practices that are involved in at-risk models, so an ACO could be one of them, but should hospices be paying attention at the physician practice level, and now assuming that their world is changing, and do they approach those physicians differently? By the way, that was a beautiful master class just now, just that little segment on, literally, you could probably take that little, we could do kind of a little capture of that, and I could see many people using that. Here's a teaching tool of how to go to the hospital, talk to their ACO. But what about some of those physician practices?
In large part, ACOs are physician practices, right? The organizers of the ACO are there's a wide range. There are ACO enablement companies like Caravan or Alidate, Agilon. Their mission is to enable providers to get into risk, and that's their business model, is to enable. And Passion is an ACO enablement platform for high needs ACOs. There are ACOs owned by hospitals still, and they think differently. They have different priorities. There are physician-led ACOs. Bluestone is a good example. Bluestone is a large geriatric primary care group focused on assisted living patients, 20% mortality rate, and they have their own. They're a provider group who runs their own. They're large enough to have their own MSSP ACO, so they got over 5,000 alignable beneficiaries on their own, and so it's an ACO with one participant, and it's them. They own the ACO, and they are the only provider in it. Most ACOs are a collection of independent providers who have signed a contract with the ACO, who in turn signs a contract with Medicare. So we have data and insights on how to sort of understand that, but calling on physician groups and calling on ACOs, they're one and the same in some regards. A lot of ACOs don't have really. Most ACOs are this organic collection of individual autonomous groups. And if you really want to drive more hospice referrals or be the preferred palliative care provider, I think you're doing that one provider group at a time. I don't know of any ACOs that say we're mandating this palliative care program across all of our ACO affiliates. I've not seen that work very well.
Yeah, which makes it difficult then, because it's not a one-stop shop for you to try to use as a leverage point to kind of move the needle on that. Yeah. Well, Bob, what final thoughts? You and I could go on all day. We're definitely going to have you back. And of course, we'll bring you back a couple of times to the Teleas Network. But any final thoughts to our listeners? And you've got hospice palliative care leaders, but you also have a lot of staff members that actually listen to this. And it feels like you're painting a picture that our world is changing. And you're not making it change. It's just the world is changing. So what final thoughts would you share with them?
Yeah, I think the first is, I think we need to look at our organization and honestly evaluate our data literacy. How strong are we at data and at math and measurement? And if we're not where we want to be, how do we get better? Because I do think we're entering a new phase, a phase that is dominated by HCC scores that most executives and staff members alike have never heard of.
Yep.
But HCC scores are an important component of the language of Medicare Advantage and the language of ACOs. Your future customers. County rates. Medicare publishes an actuarial table of what patients should cost in every county of the country. You sort of take the complexity, you multiply it by the county rate, and you get an idea of what Medicare thinks your patients should cost. So I think that's data fluency, literacy. We need to understand that math. We need to know how our customers get paid and how they think about total cost of care. And if we can't have those conversations, we're not going to be well prepared to have negotiations with these new customers. And the new customers it is an inevitability. 90% of your revenue as a hospice, 85 to 95% comes from CMS. And it just arrives full price, on time. And the future is going to be very, very different. Could be that half your revenue comes from Medicare Advantage plans, and you'll have to deal with prior authorizations and other mother may I processes, and they're not going to pay full price. And this assumes that volume stays the same, length of stay stays the same, all things equal, but they're not going to pay as much. So, how do we sit across from the negotiating table with knowledge? We've got a few years to get that knowledge, but we can't assume that it's always going to be the way it has been, even though it's been decades and decades the same way. In the very short term, the payer mix is changing, and those payers think differently, and they have different incentives. And we have to start to learn what are the incentives for different types of ACOs, what are the incentives for different types of Medicare Advantage plans, I-SNPs, D-SNPs, C-SNPs, PACE. They all are going to value different things, and they have different priorities, and we unfortunately have to become really smart about how to position our programs and our value to those new customers.
That's well said, Bob. There's a picture I get in my mind, and Dr. Will Faber, who we work with, is the amazing gentleman, voted one of the top value-based thinkers in the country. He said, so this is an analogy to interpret what you just said. There's this beautiful river that we're getting, that's our reimbursement today. And that river is about ready to fracture into all these tributaries. And not long after I heard him say that, I saw this picture that literally haunts me. And it's in South America somewhere. And there's this big river, and they built this beautiful bridge across the river. So the river is Medicare reimbursement. The bridge is hospice today. And this hurricane came, and the river totally got moved. And you got this bridge, and the river is somewhere else. And so that is what I think you're kind of cautioning us against. And we could talk about some of these things for hours. And Bob, again, you're a treasure trove. I'm so glad that you're doing the work that you're doing. You and the team at HealthPivots are amazing. You're going to be very important to our future. So thank you. And to our listeners, Bob provided a really good quote that's almost like a rallying cry, maybe a little bit of word of warning. It comes from Machiavelli. There's nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success, and more dangerous to carry through than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things, because the innovator has against him those who benefited from the old system, while those who should benefit from the new are only lukewarm friends, being suspicious as men generally are of something new and not yet experienced. In seeking of innovations, it's first necessary to establish whether the innovators depend upon the strength of others or their own. In the first case, things always go badly. And the second, they almost always succeed. And that's a quote from Machiavelli and feels very appropriate to our conversation. To our listeners, thanks for listening to TCN Talks.